All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Museum of the Albemarle for today's History for Lunch presentation. As usual, we're also streaming this on Zoom. We just ask that those of y'all who are joining us virtually to please mute your microphone and then use the chat for your questions. We'll have a Q&A session for everyone at the end of the lecture. Now, just a reminder that the next History for Lunch is scheduled for Wednesday, February 21st at noon. We will welcome representatives from Fort Riley National Historic Site. They will provide an insight into how Roanoke Island was a place of community for thousands of freedom seekers during the Civil War. Following the island's occupation by Union forces in 1862, it became a haven for African-American families from throughout the region. Their presence prompted the Union Army to establish a freedmen's colony on the northern end of Roanoke Island. So be sure to join us for that lecture on the 21st. Now, today we welcome Dr. Glen Bowman of Elizabeth City State University. Dr. Bowman will discuss the major challenges that faced Pasquotank County's Black community during the 1930s concerning economics, healthcare, and suffrage. So please join us in welcoming Dr. Bowman. Thank you.
All right, good afternoon. Happy lunchtime. History for Lunch here. We'll also like to welcome the audience and also the Zoom crowd. I know there is always been kind of a small crowd at their offices or at home. And instead, I sometimes I'm a Zoom audience member in other presentations during this time every month. So I know that we have some at home, so welcome as well. My talk today is a look back to the 1930s, economics, healthcare, and suffrage in Pasquotank County's Black community, and how this came to be. This is not something that I had ever considered talking about or researching, but anybody who does research, particularly at the state archives, understands that sometimes when you're looking for something, you find something that you didn't think was even there in the first place. Serendipity is one way to describe it. And what happened was, this was back around 2014. I was in the State Archives, Raleigh, and I was working on my book on the history of Elizabeth City State University in preparation for the university's 125th anniversary. And in my looking through the papers in the archives, I noticed some references to some study that was actually of very great interest at the time to the leadership at what we now call ECSU. John Henry Bias and Harold Trigg made reference to this study that they really were interested in. And of course, my question was, where is this study? And I couldn't find it in the state archives. And I thought, well, maybe it'll pop up someday. And sure enough, in my other research, actually kind of popped up. And it wasn't just one study, it was actually two studies. One of the studies I'm not able to at this point locate. It was actually written by the man who would become the first principal of what became the P.W. Moore Junior Senior High School. That school was founded in 1923. That school was the institution for Black students, the high school for Black students during the Jim Crow era until it closed in 1969. And now that school has been repurposed as an elementary school. Burford's Hampton University thesis, 1932, has not been found. I've tried. I went as far as actually contacting a professor at Hampton to actually go to the library itself and try to find it. And apparently they can't find it, which is kind of sad because the principal, a man named Lorenzo Stedman Burford, actually was in the first graduating class of master's candidates at Hampton back nearly 100 years ago. We can't find his dissertation. We can't find his thesis. What we do have is something else that was written around the exact same time by somebody also associated with both Elizabeth City State and P.W. Moore High School. This was a master's thesis written by Mrs. Alphonse Simpson Honeycutt. Her husband was actually the spouse of a history professor at what was called Elizabeth City State Teachers College, a man named William Honeycutt. And so her thesis is actually an exhaustive study of the 1930s based in and only in Pasquotank County. And her thesis is entitled The Social and Economic Status of Negroes in Pasquotank County, North Carolina, and its implications for secondary education. She was a teacher of secondary education at P.W. Morris, so naturally this topic interested her. And so what's interesting about this actually is a snapshot. And I tell my students at ECSU that even though people in many ways are the same today as they were in the past, people living centuries ago felt the same emotions that we feel today. They felt fear, they felt love, they felt anxiety, they felt pride, and they felt pain. And in many ways, people are the same way today. But it's a fallacy to think that life today is the same as it was in the past. And many times people forget really how much different things were back in the day. And that's kind of the theme I want you to leave you with today, is what we see around us today was not what people saw and experienced back in the 1930s. And specifically, those Black members of this county had a completely different experience than what they may experience today. So we haven't going to deal with this. I'm going to deal with economics, and then deal with such things as housing, and also then deal with something about voting rights, which some of this may surprise you. Some of this may, in many ways, surprise you more than you may anticipate. But this is based upon what this master's thesis reveals to us, based upon her data, based upon her interviews. This is not my interpretation. This is simply what she has left behind for us, based upon her study done nearly 90 years ago. Okay, economics. She refers to the poverty-ridden local population. That's a direct quotation from her. And you see here in the theme here in this section of her thesis really is about how most Blacks in the county were employed in agriculture, which may surprise some of us today, considering that most students who graduate from high school do not pursue careers in agriculture. We really, in many ways, can avoid, for the most part, most of us can avoid that experience because we have machines to take care of that for us, and we have agribusinesses, and the technology has come so far from this time. But the reality was, in the 1930s, most Blacks in the county are bound to the soil in a manner not so very different from the chattel slavery of antebellum days before the Civil War. And she gives some statistics here. And this may surprise, but between 1925 and 1930, the number of Black farmers actually had decreased by nearly a third. You might say, well, gee, 1925 to 1930, the Depression hit late 1929. Well, one of the things that people don't understand about North Carolina history is that the economy started to slow down 2 years before the Great Depression technically started. One could see the slowdown as early as 1927. And so what you see here is there were a number of Black farmers who owned their own land, and that number decreased. And only 109 out of the 667 were actually full owners, and a significant number were tenant farmers. Now, I don't know if you hear the expression or familiar with the expression tenant farmer, but a tenant farmer was a farmer who essentially worked the land for somebody else. There was a landlord who owned land. The tenant farmer did not have the capital to purchase that land, but a tenant farmer generally had the capital to own his, essentially a family's own tools and animals, but did not have the money to afford to purchase the land. A sharecropper was even arguably poorer than a tenant farmer, and then a sharecropper didn't even own the land animals, didn't own the tools. So tenant farmer essentially was somebody who basically arguably rented the land, paid the landlord from the profits, hopefully the profits from the farming. Of course, when depressions hit, the prices of commodities dropped like a rock, and that sometimes made it very hard for tenant farmers to keep their necks above water. And sometimes they had to borrow money to purchase the animals and the tools for their crafts. So sometimes the life of a tenant farmer was very precarious. And we see this even in the 1920s and 1930s. According to the thesis, the great majority of Negroes on farms in Pasquotank County are tenants. And as such, nothing more than hired hands working without wages on the lowest possible subsistence levels. So you just see here that most of those were in farming and most of them were eking out a living. Now, what does it mean? How much did they make? How low were their annual wages? From Miss Honeycutt's research, the average annual wage for a Black in farm work in the county was less than $400. Now, of course, $400 today is not $400 back in, let's say, 1935. What would this money be in 2023, 2024 money? Well, $400 back then, let's say 1935 as a baseline, would be about $8,900. Now that's annual wage. $8,900 is significantly lower than the poverty level. And we're talking here about a job that during the growing season was sun up to sundown. Very demanding, backbreaking work. You're looking here at 16-hour days, presumably, for many, for pretty much what we call today $8,900. So that's not a lot of money. And so that used to see here how the economy was very different. Now, what about others who were involved in agriculture? Well, potato pickers earned about 3 cents per bag picked. Now, by bag, I don't mean the bags you get at Food Line if you buy a 10-pound bag. I'm talking about burlap sacks. In fact, if you go upstairs before you leave to the second floor, at one of the exhibits at the very end, you notice the agriculture and how it's been the mechanization of agriculture. You see actually some examples of burlap sacks that were used for potatoes. We're talking here about 50-pound bags, 3 cents per bag picked. So all that backbreaking work to get 50 pounds of potatoes for 3 cents. Many working from 4 a.m. until sunset, and about $2-3 a day. So you're looking about like 60 to 100 maximum bags. So you're looking at, that's a lot of potatoes done by hand. And according to her research, it continued up until about 1940, her research. One issue that during the growing season, Black farmers and others who were involved in agriculture had to deal with competing labor from migrants. There were groups of migrants who would visit different stops along the East Coast, starting in Florida, making their way up north all the way to New Jersey to, let's say, pick strawberry or pick blueberries. 939 men, 240 women, and 38 children. Transient labor, so they actually kind of drove down the price of labor even more. I don't know if people know this. This is also something forgotten over time, but migrant labor continued to be a controversial issue in the decades to come in this county. I've spoken to people locally who have had farming families. They've had families that have owned land for a number of generations. There's another exhibit upstairs that actually identifies those families in the area who've had land for generations. But this was a continually an issue. In fact, in 1960, CBS did a documentary called The Harvest of Shame. And Pasquotank County is actually in that documentary. There's about a 5-minute clip that addresses the county. And again, this is over 60 years old. It's, believe it or not, it's actually available on YouTube. And you can actually look at it. It's around the 15-minute mark. And but you just see here, so farming was historically a very important part of the county. The potato crop, as we all know from the Potato Festival every May, locally dominant. And so it was a tough way to earn a living. Average wage for farm labor, $1 a day. Tenants are often promised half their produce, so they only end up getting about a third of that. And even back in the 1930s, farmers were starting to mechanize their crops with new technology coming from companies such as John Deere. And as agriculture became mechanized, that in some ways hurt the demand for labor, but in some ways freed others who would have otherwise been bound to the soil to pursue other occupations. And as I tell my students today, if you lived here 100 years ago, most people you would know would have been in agriculture. And since we have mechanization agriculture, you can pursue other jobs. You can go and major in aviation science and fly an airplane. 100 years ago, that was obviously not possible because most of those who lived in this area were bound to the soil. Why didn't tenant farmers buy their own farms? What's stopping them from buying their own land and not having to pay part of their profits to landlords? Well, some did, and some who worked really hard were able to buy small farms, but there were problems. This goes all the way back to the Civil War. The reality was, by this point, the white farmers, they owned the best land in the county. They knew the best land. They knew which land was the most fertile, and they already owned it, and they were making money off of it. They weren't going to sell that for any kind of cheap price. After the Civil War, sometimes people forget this, is that when blacks who were enslaved, and this area did have a number of free blacks, but many of those who were black actually were slaves. And they struggled with this, is how to get their own land, how to make their own living. And it was very hard to obtain land then, and it was very hard to obtain back in the 1930s. As Honeycutt observes, the most fertile lands, the most fertile areas cannot be purchased for almost any price. So that was a tough job. And so there were very few opportunities to go beyond that. Now, there were other jobs outside of farming, and one might expect. A major industrial employer was actually Foreman Blades Lumber. I knew some members of the Blades family for a number of years. Lem Blades III went to my church, good guy. But this is one of the largest lumber producing mills in the state, with a yearly output of 36 million board feet. 7 out of 8 employees who worked in the lumber mill were actually black in the county. Now, what did they make? Well, the minimum wage law at the time, 30 cents an hour. Of course, 30 cents obviously went a lot further back in the 1930s. The average weekly wage of about $11.50. So you're looking here at about $600 a year of salary. So again, the person who worked in industry probably made about 50% more than in farming. But this was also backbreaking work. This was also dangerous work. What about textile mills, of which there were many in the area at this time? Of course, there are none any longer in this area. The last one closed by around 2003, right along Hughes Boulevard, Highway 17. At this point, there really weren't, according to the research here, any black workers in textile mills. According to Honeycutt, this is interesting, is that simply just no interest, is because somehow the work schedule did not work well with people's other interests. And at the time, many would attend day-long funerals and other things. And so they really didn't want to work in mills for the long shifts. It just didn't work out that way. Now, this changed because back in the 19-teens, Elizabeth City was known nationally as one of the few places where Black women could actually work in a textile mill. The editor for the Independent newspaper, a man named William Oscar Saunders, would sometimes make mention of this in the newspaper, and his newspaper entries were actually republished in the national magazine called The Crisis, which was published by a Black academic by the name of W.E.B. Du Bois. By the 1930s, though, that had changed. There weren't any longer any Black workers in the textile mills. What about garage mechanics? $7 a week. Truck drivers, $14 to $18. Delivery personnel, $8 a week. Not a lot of money. Not a lot of money. Though the best paying jobs seem to have been in education. Some Black teachers who worked at schools such as P.W. Moore and the dozen or so elementary schools in the county earned about $100 a month. Now that's for 8 months, not 12 months. That's 8 months. So by $800 a year in that regard. Some of them did. Not all of them did. And if you looked at the salary scale, which you could actually see in the county and city school board minutes, is that only the ones who had experience earned $100 a month. Some of them earned a lot less than that. The average about $86.59. The highest earning Black educator was the principal of P.W. Morris School, and that was Ebby Anderson, $170.50 a month. That was for, I think, a 10-month-a-year job. So not bad. And that was actually one of the highest paying jobs. The principal was one of the highest earning Blacks in Pasquotank County at the time. On average, working in industry, $18 a week. Domestic service. Noted that many Black women at this time were involved in domestic service. Many of these women who worked as house servants and cooks and maids actually were trained at what we call today now ECSU. There was a program back in the 1920s and before that gave Black women a chance to learn skills of domestic service. A third in the area depended on relief. 1/5 of whites in the county also were dependent upon relief too. There was some relief, there were some welfare efforts, but not to the degree that they're on today. Now let's come to housing. Let's come to housing, because what a person makes tells you part of the story, but what housing opportunities were available and what those costs were also are important details. Just as if we know today, most of our paychecks oftentimes, or much of our paychecks, go towards the mortgage. Or even if you own your own home outright, you still have to pay insurance and taxes. And of course, those taxes went up last year, and insurance is going to go up this year. So those costs are not insignificant. This is a picture, and again, it's very hard to find pictures that actually are printable. This is actually a picture of a Black neighborhood around 1940 in the county. Notice a couple of things here. This actually may have been one of the more well-off Black neighborhoods in the county, because there was actually seemingly possibly some electricity. Looks like an electric pole. Notice the roads are dirt, and that was very common throughout most of the county. Paved roads in many parts of the county did not exist. They were dirt roads that had a pretty good gravel base, so they wouldn't get washed out often unless there was some major storm. Notice the shacks. These actually may have been this probably was one of the better neighborhoods in the area. Just to give you some pictures here. What does Honeycutt say about existence? Many live a hand-to-mouth existence, and their homes suggest a poor and lowly life. Now, note that most did not own their homes outright. Most were actually renters. Now, understand that today we have more regulations that protect those who rent, so they're not living in squalor, and so that there are standards. Now, of course, those standards are not always followed to the degree they should be, but they do exist to a greater degree than they did back in the 1930s. But Honeycutt's outright says a place is inhabited by the majority fit the description of slums. And these were slums, and just be blatant here. Many of the streets, most of the streets are unimproved dirt streets and are without sewage. Many homes in this area actually did not have indoor plumbing. There were a number of what we might call porta potties that were kind of done by wood, the old odd houses. And again, one of these days I'm going to write, I do try to write for the Daily Advance a couple times a year, and I have a story in the back of my head about how that ended, because there was a massive problem with these odd houses in the form of rodents. And so the town, I mean, at that time we had cats and dogs and rats that were about the size of some cats and dogs. That's just life, how it was. And that's changed, but the story of how we got rid of the rats is actually quite interesting. The homes in the rural part of the county lack, for the most part, electricity and plumbing. No electricity, no plumbing, splintered floors with cracks that reveal the ground beneath them, windows boarded up, grass where the glass is broken, no inside plumbing, pumps, outdoor water pumps. Today, of course, we have indoor plumbing and tap water, and most people won't even drink the tap water. If you go to someone's house and they serve you tap water, you're thinking, what's wrong with you? Where's your bottled water? You got it, those bottles you get at Walmart or Costco. We've come a long way, but drinking water from a pump. Just imagine going to someone's house party and they're pumping the water outside the pump. You're like, is that safe? Probably. What about the homes in the town here? They were better from this Honeycutt. City homes have an indoor toilet, but are rarely paved streets. Still, electricity is for the most part unaffordable. and food is not cooked through nice microwaves or toaster ovens or air fryers, of course, but through wood stoves. Wood stoves can work. Some people I know have wood stoves today. They don't usually cook their food on the wood stove unless they have some cabin in the woods. But that's how life was for those who lived in the county, who many were Black and many whites had the same experience. Home ownership, 70% were renters, only 30% were owners. What would the rent run? About $250 a week, $130 a year. Of course, rent's a lot higher today, though everybody knows that. In the whole county, only about 138 Blacks actually were homeowners. The vast majority of Blacks actually rented their homes. They were slums. The homes were slums. And as Honeycutt points out, the owners of these slums were actually the landed aristocracy of the town. Some of these landed aristocrats were extremely wealthy. One, probably the most famous landowner who rented Black slums out was a man named Edwin F. Adlet. He was at one point the district attorney in the federal court in the eastern part of North Carolina. He was a longtime chair of the Elizabeth City School Board, and a piece of work. When he passed away in 1931, his income, his estate was estimated at about $300,000, which at the time, with today's terms, would be close to $10 million. He was an attorney. He was involved in the Nell Cropsey murder case. So, I mean, he was a very prominent person in the town. And he was probably the most wealthy landed aristocrat. But the reality is, for most Blacks, they were not able to even get a loan because there were restrictions and Jim Crow restrictions that prohibited them from getting capital. It was a completely unfair process. So many were forced to rent, and these homes were substandard. We wouldn't put our animals in these kind of homes today. Some of them were that bad. Okay, what about healthcare? All right, according to Honeycutt, the condition health reveals a lack of proper nutriment. This is her quotation, proper nutriment and proper sanitary facilities. So yes, there were some challenges, there were some problems. Greatest cause of death actually was tuberculosis, a lung disease, very common at the time. My grandfather's first wife actually died of tuberculosis. And then he remarried my grandmother, and that's how my mother was born. So tuberculosis was a very common cause of death for everybody back in the 1920s and 1930s. And I hear it's making a slight comeback in some places. Heard that. Hope it's not true. At that time, we did have a hospital. We did have the Albemarle Hospital because of the work of a man named Dr. John Saliba. And this was segregated. There was a white wing and there was a black wing. The black wing was notoriously insufficient, not as good as that for whites. Patients were turned away. They did not have the same kind of protections that we have today. Honeycutt notes the high mortality, children and infants. Many did not make it to the age of 5. Things such as scurvy, lack of vitamin C, lack of milk in diet. And physicians in town, people such as Dr. E.L. Hoffler, George Washington Cardwell organized a group called the Pasquotank Better Health Association. And there were other prominent physicians and dentists who were associated with that as well. So there were efforts to improve the healthcare for Blacks in the county, but it was an uphill battle. Okay, what about social and cultural life? According to her, and I just read this because I think this is a good quotation. I don't want to put it in my words. The dual system of education with fewer provisions, poor physical equipment, and poor pay for instruction, the segregation of public carriers, libraries, and places of amusement, the restriction of residential areas, and the physical neglect of areas assigned Negroes all contribute to the concentration of the qualities and characteristics within the group that are not conducive to a healthy emotional life. She is in some giving a very direct summary of what Jim Crow meant for the day-to-day life of Blacks living in this county. And I should say, arguably statewide inarguably, in the region. And the North wasn't a whole lot better. The North had its own different set of issues. The reality was that Jim Crow hurt people. Okay, the separation, the segregation led to basically a second-class life, second-class citizenship for Blacks who lived in the county. There were opportunities though for entertainment. The community center, there was a community center for Blacks, and not as attended as well as other amusements such as dance halls and clubs. And they had a lot more dance halls and a lot more clubs back then. A lot of things today that we don't see in our downtown were actually very prevalent back at this time. Some gambling houses and houses of ill repute did exist. There were no public parks, so at this time, at least public parks that we see today. In other words, if a Black child wanted to learn to play and go to a playground, that did not exist until a couple of decades later on. There was actually a park that was later established, what is by now Roanoke Avenue. That became Charles Graves Park. That was not until the 1950s. There was a tennis court at P.W. Moore High School, not used that much. You can see her, she's trying to grasp at straws here. She's trying to find something positive to say here, and there's not a whole lot to be said. What about crime? According to Honeycutt, crime was about equal. There was no racial difference in terms of crime rates. Now, in her estimation, this was her estimation, race relations were very pleasant. Public Utilities Commission pays for the utilities for the Black Community Center. The city pays for a caretaker for the Black cemetery. And of course, that's Oak Grove Cemetery, which is located right off of Harrington Road in town here. So, I mean, but again, some things that might be surprising here. The county has a clear record as far as violence is concerned. Radical movements do not exist. As one might expect here, Pasquotank County was a conservative county. And so there really weren't any, we call radical movements. There weren't radical, meaning in this case, communist movements, not at this point. And though I just should say in the 1940s, there started to be some greater tensions racially in the county. There was actually some people have called a riot in 1940 right outside of this building here at what was at that time called the Gaiety Theater. There was a riot there, and I actually wrote about that in the Daily Advance around 2018. I'm still doing some work on that when I have some time here, but at that point, this was a pretty conservative part of the state and country. But still, Honeycutt notes that Blacks in the area as a group see themselves as distinct and apart from the normal life of the area established by the dominant race. So you see the separation, you see the distinctions, you see that in the housing, you see that in the entertainment, you see that in, even on Sunday morning in churches, you just see simply enough a dual existence. Okay, I'm almost done here. I want to leave you with something that might be surprising, but suffrage. Suffrage, if you don't know, has to do with the right of a person to cast a ballot in an election. And to put some context here, this was her writing in the 1930s. If this had been written back 30 years earlier, this may have been very different, but she writes here, and this is a direct quotation from her: "The suffrage of the Negro is limited in Pasquotank County, not because of the restrictions placed on them, but because of the lack of interest." Interesting point here. According to her, prior to the election of 1940, the registrars announced that they would be bringing their books to the community center and register those who were eligible, but not many appeared, it seems. And when Honeycutt asked them, or we found out why there were very few who actually wanted to be registering to vote, they told her, and this is her exact words here, "It isn't worthwhile. They'll do what they want to do anyway." And now to put this in context here, and I actually just talked about this on campus last week. I talked about the history of disenfranchisement. What happened in 1898, there was an election. And once the election was over, there was a strong push by the Democratic Party to disenfranchise Black North Carolinians. And in 1900, there was a referendum that took place in July. And the state voters voted by about 3-2 to change the Constitution, and those changes ended up disenfranchising the vast majority of Blacks. And so what happened is the Democratic Party, once this happened, was able to become dominant. And much of the 20th century in North Carolina is the history of a one-party state, the one-party state being the Democratic Party. There was not a non-democratic governor until 1972. This area, there was not a Black congressperson elected in North Carolina until Eva Clayton in 1992. So by the late 1930s, what had happened was the one-party state was in power, and they had a primary every summer before an election year. And by that point, the Democratic Party was so dominant that many Blacks, it seems, of the opinion that, well, why vote? Because it's not going to matter. And so what you see here is voter apathy and coming in here. And the sad part is back in 1898, many Black voters fought and risked their lives to vote in the polls to stop this from happening. Literally, there were men standing at the poll places with guns, wearing red shirts, and many black men voted despite that threat. And by the 1930s, even though there may have been a chance for them to vote, they thought, what's the point? The system's corrupt. The caste has died. The system is what it is. They're going to do what they want to do anyway. And you see that voter apathy. That's kind of sad in that regard. So not to leave on a negative note, but it is what it is. It was what it was, according to Miss Honey. Okay, I try to run through this quickly because I know it's lunchtime, and lunch is, you usually don't get a lot of time for lunch, at least in most places. Any questions? Yes.
I wonder if you would give a little more background on the last thing that you mentioned.
A little more background?
Is that the grandfather clause?
That is correct. That is correct. Yes. No.
Exactly what that is. And I think I found that very few people in North Carolina know what that is.
I can provide some context here. I'm going to try to not go into super detail, though I could easily do that, but I'd take the time here. What happened was in the 1890s, there was a movement in this state and also in the nation called the populist movement. And in North Carolina, there was something called a fusionist government. And in the 1890s, Republicans and farmers and others united together in opposition to the Democratic Party. And in the 1890s, this fusionist government was very effective. By 1898, the Democratic Party was angry that they were out of power. And so they tried to figure out ways to get back into power. And what was decided by Party Chair Fernald Fold Simmons, later US Senator, was that they were going to have a campaign to scare white voters into abandoning the fusionist government, the populists, the Republican Party, and moving to the Democratic Party. And so what they did is they came up with a white supremacy campaign. And that was literally what they called it. It's not my words. That was what it was called. And the whole goal was to scare voters into thinking that Blacks were taking over the state and taking over power. And so you needed to get rid of them. You needed to vote the Democrats in, and we will clean up government, and we will not let this happen again. And this was a very effective campaign. This was voter intimidation. And the election of 1898 completely flipped the state. Before, let's give an example, in the state Senate, after the election of 1896, there were 43 members out of the 50 who were in the fusionists. They were populist Republicans. It was 43-7, 7 Democrats. After the 1898 election, it went from 43-7 to 10-40. Democrats went from 7 seats to 40 seats. And what happened is in 1900, the Democratic Party, now in control of the General Assembly, decided that they were going to promote a referendum that was going to change the Constitution. And that was done in July 1900. What this referendum essentially did was create, as Matt pointed out here, a grandfather clause. The way it worked was it was now the state constitution that if you could prove that you had an ancestor who could vote before 1867, you were automatically grandfathered in. You did not need to do anything else except register to vote. So that meant that a white person who was a white man, because no women at this time could vote, a white man who was illiterate could vote as long as his ancestors could vote before 1867. Now, why did they choose 1867? Because no Black could vote in North Carolina until 1867. So what it did is it grandfathered any and all illiterate white men. They didn't have to prove literacy. Meanwhile, now Blacks had to prove literacy. And they had to go before registrars who were clearly not unbiased, who were motivated and strongly encouraged by their own prejudices to keep Blacks from voting. And so what happened is the voting simply just plummeted. Now, note that the grandfather clause did not mention anything about race. It did not mention color, it did not mention ethnicity, it did not mention Black, it did not mention the word Negro. All it did was create a set of conditions that grandfathered certain individuals in, and that meant that Black voting completely plummeted. And there were Blacks who voted in Pasquotank County after the grandfather clause. There were many members of the Shannon family. They were very prominent Black farmers. Later on, Irving Shannon actually became the first Black justice of the peace since Reconstruction. This was 1962. So there were a few, and I'm pretty sure P.W. Moore, who was a principal at what we now call ECSU, could vote because people liked him and they respected him. But this essentially disenfranchised most Blacks after 1900. And so that led to essentially a one-party state in which the Democratic Party controlled everything, both houses of the General Assembly and the governor's mansion, and basically could do what they wanted to. So the point here is that by the 1930s, Blacks knew that it's not going to matter what we do because it's over. They got the reins of power. And so essentially the 20th century was, North Carolina was a one-party state. Now, the ironic thing is this was called the Democratic Party. And yet this was, to me at least, completely antithetical to democracy. You can't have a one-party state and be a democracy. You can't. We call those dictatorships. We call those other things, perhaps. So this was pivotal. And I think it just shows the apathy, simply the giving up. The giving up of people. In other words, life was hard. You see that in the agricultural life. You see it as the day-to-day labor. You see it in everything. And so why not vote to make a difference? It's not going to make a difference. And it's, you almost see that inner attempt, that almost inner giving up. And that's heartbreaking because that's the last thing you want your child to ever do in life is give up and lose faith. And so you see this. Hope that helps clear things up. Okay, great question, Matt. Any other questions? Yes.
I have enjoyed your presentation.
Thank you.
You know, but it's interesting, like growing up in Pasquotank County, a Black child in the 60s,
Yes.
when I noticed that it said like no park. And so in the county, you know, there were always fields. So
Fields, yes.
we played
Mhm.
baseball, dodgeball.
Mhm.
And it's funny because when I got older and there were parks, I never felt safe because our neighborhood fields, you know, you knew everyone,
Yes.
everyone playing. And by the time, you know, I lived in the cities and it's parks and drainage, you know, and I was like, ooh, and so, you know, people would say, oh, you know, that's still a park. And there was always hesitation because, you know, growing up where the areas where you play, it's neighborhood. So
Yes.
it was interesting when I saw that because it just made me think of how parks were not, I won't say valued, but, they were just open to anybody. And so I was not as comfortable, going to a
Sure.
park and our neighborhood feel. Which was actually for a time a part of the new Oak Grove Cemetery that,
Oh, okay.
there wasn't anything there, so it was huge.
Interesting. Interesting. Thank you. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for sharing. Yes.
I'd like to talk a little bit more about this lady writing this dissertation. My
Yes.
concern here is the one that, I'm a historian, so it's kind of one of those things where it's like, we're concerned about bias. We're concerned about, she's going out into the community. She's going out into Pasquotank County. She's talking to people. Are you interested in voting? Do you want to register to vote? All that kind of stuff. They are tenant farmers, they're sharecroppers, they're wage workers. They know for a fact that their livelihood depends upon maintaining a certain type of base.
Mhm.
And if they register to vote, they can be kicked out of that house, they can be blackballed, they can
Perhaps so.
get a job anywhere in this county.
So
And so, we're looking at evidence of bias. Like that.
Absolutely.
She's the wife of the-
she was a wife. Well, she actually was a teacher at what we call what was called PW Moore Junior Senior High School. That was a school for Black students here in the county. Her husband was a professor at Elizabeth City State Teachers College, and that was at this time, it is today it's an HBCU, but at that time, all members of the staff, all students, all were Black. I would say, well, at least we're non-white. So she's coming from the perspective of a Black female educator who has gained trust because at this time, Black teachers were among the most respected members of the community. Because they had a noble profession. Unfortunately, teachers don't always are not always held in that same regard today as they were back then. So she's coming from that position. Now, again, she's coming from a position, if you want to talk about bias, she is coming from a position of relative economic advantage because she is in education. She has a very secure job. And just like all of us have biases that are shaped by our own experiences, those are her experiences. But yeah, that's the limitations of this kind of and doing history in general is even if we have perfectly precise data, and she's trying to collect and accumulate data. How do you know the veracity of your data is suitable for research? You do the best you can. And that's even true today. If you take a survey, if you take a poll, how do you know the poll is accurate? There's always a margin of error. How do you know people are not lying on the polls? I've heard that happens today. Is people call you and say, who are you voting for? I'm voting for this person, but actually you're just saying that because you don't trust the pollsters. You want to just tell them the opposite just because you want to mess them up. I mean, that is a question, and which is kind of why I explain this is based upon, but in terms of data, this is really exhaustive for the county. I can't imagine anything that would be more exhaustive because, yeah, but it's limited in that degree, which is the thing about history. Well,
You got to believe what people say.
They do.
Oh,
yeah. Sure. Yeah.
But you find this other data.
I wish I had Burford's. I wish I had a Lorenzo Burford's, and I'm still going to try. But again, I talked to a professor who actually went to the library. I mean, that's pretty good because they don't let you. This is at Hampton University. They just don't let people on in Hampton. You have to have a reason to be there, and Hampton's 90 miles away. And I really want to drive 90 miles away and maybe get turned down. Unless I'm going someplace else up there, maybe if I'm like up there doing Busch Gardens and on the way back, I don't know. But it's a long way to go to get turned down. But he actually went there. And I'm just curious where it is because it's only located there. And but Bertha was the principal at the same school where Honeycutt taught. And I wish I had more than one. And I was hoping to have more than one because I planned this for a couple of years and I've been just waiting and I just finally gave up. So, but I definitely, we tried to library alone here at ECSU and turned down there. And she's good at ECSU. She finds stuff I can't believe she finds. She couldn't get me this. the Burford thesis from Hampton. Yes.
Like to say, literacy is key.
Yes.
The author of this report was literate.
Yes.
And so literacy was in the Constitution, the literacy requirement. And there are Black people at that time that could pass the literacy test, so there are some that could vote.
Mhm.
But I do think it puts it in context, but a larger context might suggest the thesis that she was writing about was about secondary education, which speaks to literacy.
That's right.
So while she didn't complain about literacy or reported that people did not want to vote, you sort of read between the lines. Her concern was literacy.
That's a great point. And people sometimes forget this as well. But most people most residents did not go beyond grade 7. My grandfather passed away in 1980. He passed away in his 60s back in 1988. He only finished grade school. He finished grade 7. He didn't finish high school. I have his grade school diploma on my wall at home in my bedroom. Many people did not, this is from Pennsylvania. Most people did not go beyond grade 7. What was special about P.W. Moore, what became P.W. Moore High School, was that this was really, other than the high school program at State Normal School, the only opportunity for Blacks to earn a high school education. And most of them did not go beyond that part because they couldn't afford it. Their families needed them to be working out in the fields, doing labor. So you had 7th graders who finished their education, who were 13 years old, finishing their school, then you work on the farm. Now today we would say, what do you mean? You're 13 years old, you should be in school. Back at this time, 13-year-olds were very much seen in working in farms because their families needed them, because they needed to eke out a living. Because you can see here the data. If you don't eke out a living and you didn't have enough income, you might struggle just to make it to the next growing season. And so, and Honeycutt's trying to promote the idea here is that we need more secondary education. We need to develop that program. And that's what happened. That's what happened. And the reason for that is because as agriculture became mechanized, there was less demand for labor out in the fields. And that means kids could stay home, go to school, finish high school, and then reach their potentials academically. And so in that way, I mean, she was really on the cusp of things changing. This was almost like the end of how life used to be, because things rapidly changed, because you have World War II coming shortly after this, and then you have completely things changing forever. And so that's why we can recognize this world. Great questions. Yes.
For Black what is it migration?
What turned the tide? What turned the tide in terms of how their lives improved? I think one reality was, and this was one of my things I think gets understated, is the mechanization of agriculture freed people from having to work on the farms. They could now, and then that expanded opportunities at school. And then the community college movement in the early 1960s, a COA was established in 1962. That was one of the first in the state. And people could actually learn skills other than farming because there was less demand for laborers in the fields. And so that meant that people, and that in many ways created the Black middle class, was now Blacks could go to college, earn 4-year degrees, become psychologists, become social workers, become chemists, become engineers, become lawyers, become medical doctors at a much greater level than before, because people were freed from the soil. And the mechanization of agriculture, John Deere, and now agriculture today, most people can live their lives without even having to be exposed to it. They just know they go to the store and they have all the food they can buy and more, because it's grown by agribusinesses that have technology, that use drones to find out which parts of the soil need more fertilizer. I mean, it's all done with science. And the productivity on per acre is just mushroomed because of technology. So in that way, is technology, inventions freed, that's a major factor, and that opened up education, high school graduation, universities, community colleges and such. Yes, my opinion.
If I may answer that. On
Yes,
a personal level.
okay, please do.
It was Pell Grants and federal funding.
Yes.
Up to that point, people really could not afford it. So literally, everyone, that I knew of, that were in college in the seventies, the first generation, it was the Pell Grants and the money from the federal government, that allowed them to go.
That's true.
Otherwise, having a neighbor that was a contractor, working in fields, those who didn't, they continued, working there. So I would, undoubtedly say the biggest difference, came when the federal government, began to get grants. And that just allowed countless people to be first generation of college students.
During this time, the 1930s, the federal government was very much not involved in education because it was seen as a local issue, not a federal issue. And then starting in the Johnson administration in the mid-1960s, there started to be a definite more federal involvement, which explains the rapid desegregation of schools in the late 1960s. That was the federal government putting pressure on schools that said, either you do this, either you follow the federal law, i.e. as ruled in Brown versus Board in 54, or else we're going to withdraw federal funds. But yeah, that's definitely a key part. But to get to universities, you need to finish high school. And during this time, most people they couldn't even dream of a college experience. They could not even dream. But as the federal government expanded in education, then you start seeing the Pell Grants, which still to this day have a tremendous impact upon students who live in this area, because this remains one of the more impoverished areas in North Carolina today, despite all the advancements. We still have a ways to go in that regard. But these are great comments and questions. Thank you. Hi.
Back before you go, and they answer the question, well, why did they want to do? What you failed to mention was that indeed there was an implicit threat to your livelihood as if you went to go. It was kind of the literacy tests that they had to take, and sometimes there were poll taxes and other things that they had to take, as well as the threat of having their livelihood taken, fear, burning of their property, burning their crops, burning their family, lynching, all of those things were still very much alive at that time. So we cannot gloss over the reasons that Blacks did not vote at that particular time, because it was not just, oh, we're just apathetic, we don't care about voting. I'd like to make that clear.
This is from her perspective. This is Ms. Honeycutt's perspective, not my perspective. If I were to analyze it, I would include that. I would say point out that the poll tax in North Carolina was different than many states in the South. There was a poll tax, and part of the 1900 era changes and that disenfranchised most Black voters, and for that matter, also some white voters, did have a poll tax, but the poll tax as a requirement to vote was ended in North Carolina in 1919. Some of the states kept it on until the 1960s, until federal government changed that Voting Rights Act in 1965. Some states, North Carolina still had a poll tax, but it was not a requirement to vote. They effectively abolished the poll tax for everybody in 1972. Some states went a lot further than North Carolina. Actually, some states would actually have all white primaries, in which only whites could go and vote in the primaries. And of course, everybody knew that the primaries, that was the election. because the Republican candidate wasn't going to win because it would be 70% Democratic, 30% Republican. There was no way. And so the real fight was the Republican, I'm sorry, was a Democratic primary. And that was the case in North Carolina long after that.
That's not found in the Constitution. 1950, the Supreme Court case in Texas, it was all white.
Yeah, that was correct. But there were all kinds of shenanigans that were meant to keep those people from voting. And they didn't want, and again, as I talked about this last week, I talked about the disenfranchisement, and I went into the nitty-gritty details of election fraud, about voter intimidation, and outright fraud. I mean, just outright not letting people vote. In other words, people showed up and they kept challenging every voter until they just took their time until the polls closed. Up, sorry, it's over. And there's still a long line. I mean, there were all kinds, as Dr. Blackman pointed out, there were all kinds of shenanigans, which is why we do need to understand what this thesis states in context. But at the same time, I don't feel that it's my place to basically, this is what I wanted this to speak for itself. But yeah, it's correct. There were a lot of shenanigans in the polls at that time. And after that time, for sure. So we need to keep that in mind, is that, and all those shenanigans basically threaten our democratic way of life, because they did not present and lead to a result that reflected the will of the people. All right, other questions? Yes. Hi.
People receiving debrief. You gave two figures during the presentation. What was the difference in the percentage of given to each group? Yes.
Well, according to Honeycutt's research, about 1 out of 3 Blacks in the county received relief, and about 1 out of 5 whites received relief. According to her, and again, those were state figures, those numbers were available, but that is what her research indicates.
Okay, difference in the amount given to each group.
I don't know if that's the case. I don't know how it worked at that time. It depends. I don't know the details in terms of income levels, if it was some kind of sliding scale. Yeah, I mean, and that's the part that's kind of frustrating is this is an imperfect picture. It's the picture we have, and I wish we had more. It is, and that's the thing about history, is we really have what we have, and we wish we had more, and we wish we knew the little details. And yeah, that's one of the challenges of doing history. But yeah, that's a good question. Other questions? These have been great comments and questions here. I appreciate that. I appreciate the audience here. This is more than I expected for a sunny Wednesday afternoon. I thought we'd have a lot more in Zoom land. Maybe we even have more in Zoom land. I don't know, but I appreciate everybody for being here. So thank you. Yes, sir. Oh, hi.
Person to statistics that you were quoting earlier. What's changed?
What's changed? In terms of the current data? In terms of land ownership, to be honest, I have not, that data is collected by the state. We have far more bean counters now than we did back during this time. I have not looked at the census from 2020. The kind of data is available in the census report of 2020. I have not done that. And I've looked at other censuses from past eras. That's kind of my job, is looking at census data. This is not based upon mere census data. This is actually based upon going out and doing oral interviews and such. But so I don't want to take a guess here. I don't want to guess. But it's changed. These numbers are constantly in flux, and I wonder about housing, because housing has become unaffordable for many. Housing prices have gone way up. Interest rates have gone way up. And I wonder what the impact it has on housing. Though there are benefits that are available now that did not exist back in the 1930s. There are certain plans and such, and but I wonder, but I don't feel comfortable enough to make guesses in the dark. Sure.
Having racial breakdowns, but there's still a very large percentage of rental housing versus ownership in what's considered.
Sure.
The data that I've seen recently is that it's now 70%. That does not have a demographic.
Yeah. Yeah. And there are different causes for that. I mean, there are many people who are local. Sure, it does to a certain degree. There's also, we have Coast Guard, university. I know many university faculty don't even live here in North Carolina. They live in Virginia. They're kind of like state traders in that way. They know they don't, they live up there. They work down here, then they take the highway up north. So that means, I don't know. I mean, yeah, that seems to make, that would make sense to me. But again, I'm not gonna, I don't know. So I'm gonna leave it at that. All right. Thank you, everybody.